through. We are looking at presidential behavior in particular, not just because political science study it, although that is a good reason, and historians as well. But it's a way to look at the presidency steadily across time in terms of how it has developed. We know much of the constitutional constraints on the president have not changed. The job is still very much the same one it was at the beginning in terms of the Constitution. However, much has changed in terms of what we expect from presidents, and therefore their behavior has changed. So we can look to these theories as a way to predict behavior of current and future presidents. Based on assessments really of old presidents, and also to provide advice to leaders and presidents. If you want to be a good president, do this. If you want to not be a bad president, avoid doing this, etc. So before we do that, I wanted to look at the three articles we looked at last week, because I think that's a good entryway into why we are actually talking about this. So the Neustadt article talked about the president's real power being the power to persuade, and the power to persuade is affected by those around him or her, and their view of how much power the president has and how much sway the president has with the electorate. Orenstein talked about the Green Lantern theory of the presidency, and how people believe that if the president just tries harder, he or she could do more. That people often ignore historical elements, so things like the JFK assassination, the Great Recession, 9/11, etc., are not taken into account. Presidents are just asked to do more and do it better. And that this sets up the president, any president, for failure. And then Greenblatt adds to that no president can meet the expectations set out for him or her, especially in modern times, because the opposition party is less likely to send over members who cross over and support every now and again, but also because the electorate as a whole is so polarized, and that it's acting as its own check on the president. And if we link that back up, that fits right back into what Neustadt talks about in terms of people's perceptions of how powerful the president is. So keeping all of this in mind, what we can take away is that the power to persuade is really the president's key power, especially in domestic matters. So the president's power to persuade has to be factored into these assessments of past behavior on behalf of presidents. So many people say that, some presidents are very Machiavellian, and what does that all mean? Well, Machiavelli actually was not writing a book about how to be a tyrant necessarily, but what he was writing was an advice book about what princes, not presidents, but princes should do in order to keep power. There are questions as to whether he meant this kind of tongue-in-cheek or whether he actually meant this straightforward. But we can take away some key things and kind of analyze it in terms of our presidency. So Machiavelli, if he were speaking to our presidents, might be able to give some advice. One of those pieces of advice might be to earn your own power. That there are many ways to come to power, but the best is to be beholden to no one, and compared to no one, so that people are not constantly seeking out whether the people who owe you or you owe are actually in control. So earning your own power, being your own man, is a powerful theme, and we see that presidents as candidates use this a lot, that they're beholden to nobody, that they answer to no one, that they're self-made in some way, shape, or form. In fact, in modern times, it's kind of usually a bad thing to not be self-made, to be born into wealth or privilege. It's better to be born into the middle class and make your way up. There's also the issue of the Machiavellian mask. And what I mean by this is that Machiavelli says that a leader, a prince, or in our case a president, will at times need to be a lion and at other times need to be a fox. That the mask is necessary because it's important that a leader appears to be virtuous, but it's impossible to be virtuous all the time and also be effective. So a lion is the virtuous side, where you act like a lion and use direct and sweeping force. So you you can see how this might come into play. Lions stalk their prey for sure, but then when they're ready to pounce, they pounce. They're direct, they're strong. They use what he calls un unto trato, or one fell swoop, in order to appear resolute in what they do. On the other hand, there are times when a president needs to act like a fox, or use indiscretion, cunning, and surprise to meet the challenge of the time. And the Machiavellian mask allows the president to act like a fox in order to get things done, but also use the part of the mask that's the lion to earn respect and power over those who he governs. Machiavelli says that leaders should engage in grand projects domestically. Machiavelli talks a lot about war, and we're not going to really go into that here, but one of the things he says is that you'll need to give people back home a reason to be hopeful and productive, and that grand projects can be that thing. And we see this a lot in our president's attempts to do something domestically that is a big project. So every president has these large projects that are associated with him. Some of them are viewed positively, some of them are not, but over time they tend to kind of all be viewed as a fairly decent thing. So Eisenhower had the interstate highway system, FDR had all the New Deal stuff. You can argue about what Clinton's was. Maybe it was welfare reform, and so people might think differently on that. George W. Bush attempted to do what I would think of as two grand domestic projects, one being the Medicare Part D prescription drug for seniors, and the other being No Child Left Behind. Again, how you rate those depends. And of course, Obama with the Affordable Care Act. So all presidents try to attach themselves to these grand projects, to be known for something and remembered for something. Finally, Machiavelli says that prudent archers aim high. And what he means here is that for those of you who have ever done archery or shooting or anything, if you aim directly for the target, the force of gravity is going to bring your arrow down, and you're going to fall below the target. And if people constantly see you falling below the target, they're going to view you as ineffective. So Machiavelli says aim higher than the target, fall closer to the target, and that way you will achieve success, but more importantly, you'll achieve power because people will see you as successful. So prudent archers aim high, they don't aim directly at the target. So Machiavelli is more of an advice manual, but you can see how we've incorporated many of these things into our presidency, not formally, but based on the behavior of those who occupy the role. Jeffrey Tulis is a political scientist who talks a lot about political communication and rhetoric. And he says that the presidency itself has two distinct eras based on rhetoric and how it was used. One is the pre-rhetorical era, and the other is the rhetorical era. The pre-rhetorical era is the 18th and 19th century, so everybody through the end of the 19th century, or mid-19th century, that pre-rhetorical presidents governed what he says more legitimately in thoughtful ways, in that they wrote out their concerns. Most of the State of the Unions were written, they weren't delivered as speeches. But that this changed around the time of Lincoln, essentially, and didn't really gain favor until the 20th century, when presidents started appealing directly to the public as opposed to Congress. So pre-20th century, with a limitation in the case of Lincoln, but then that was brought up again in the 20th century, generally speaking, presidents would address Congress, and that they would deal with Congress directly on matters of domestic and foreign policy. They wouldn't direct their concerns directly to the people. And they would do this only in writing and only to Congress. And he says that even though some people, like, let's say, Teddy Roosevelt, did appeal directly to the people, and Teddy Roosevelt in his bully pulpit, they did it within the confines of the pre-rhetorical presidency. They didn't tell people what they should do in terms of their congressional representatives in the presidency, they instead appealed to them for a variety of other reasons. So the rhetorical era, he says, produces trouble. This starts, he says, with Wilson's attempts to get the League of Nations passed, and because he was having such trouble with Congress, as you may remember from your history classes, he started appealing to the people so that they could influence their lawmakers. In other words, he did a run around Congress to influence their constituents, who would then influence them. This message conflicted with the one he sent directly to Congress and caused problems, and ultimately the League of Nations failed because Wilson could not successfully get the Senate to ratify it. But the idea as a whole is that there's this second era, right, that is different from the first, that is not based in constitutional guidelines, but is rather a new norm of going directly to the people. So there are problems with this, and one of those problems is the potential for demagoguery. Tulis says that demagoguery can be distinguished from a leader in two main ways. First, a demagogue appeals to the popular mood's more temporary requests, whereas a leader appeals to durable majority sentiment. In other words, the demagogue picks up on these temporary flickers of emotions, what Madison called these passions that incite factions. A demagogue will pick up on those, whereas a leader looks to stability and stable sentiment. Second, the demagogue's motivations are more dubious in that they lie in the desire for the individual personal power for the president rather than those of the leader, who are rooted in fostering a permanent interest of the community. In other words, a demagogue picks up on this for his own personal gain, not for the gain of the country as a whole. So the primary problem with the rhetorical presidency is that it opens up the potential for demagoguery. While he did not say that this was necessarily happening, he did say that Wilson came close, and there are arguments that after this was published, maybe there were some attempts as well. There are a few additional problems with the rhetorical presidency. When policy messages are delivered directly to the people, not the policymakers, there is often conflicting viewpoints. Public sentiment is difficult to grasp and boil down, and this makes the job of Congress really hard to do. And policy suffers as a result. In the worst case scenario, such as LBJ's War on Poverty, rhetoric leads the charge and the policy doesn't actually shine through. In other words, what we have is a weakened policy production, and that has real consequences for the policy that is put out. So Tulis, to sum up, would argue that the presidency has changed based on the use of rhetoric and communication over time. Skowrnek argues that you can actually place presidents into one of four boxes based on where they fall in what he calls political time. So let's take a step back. The basic idea of Skowrnek's model is that you can put any president in any one of these four categories and predict that president's overall success or failure because American politics is so cyclical. He says that there are two types of time, political time and historical time. Historical time is year 1 to year 10, right? It runs in order sequentially. Things happen. It's a generic timeline. Political time is this 4-step process that actually acts as a cycle over time. So if we were to look at a longer historical time frame, you'd have multiple sets of these 4. So you'd have, one reconstructive, articulating, preemptive, disjunctive, and then another set. And what happens, he says, is a vulnerable regime is sensed by a reconstructive politician who seeks to usurp the powers that be, and then that person creates a new role for the president and is articulated by several others who follow in his footsteps, which is then preempted by someone on the other side, and you have a disjunction which creates a vulnerable regime, and it starts all over again. Excuse me. So, let's put that into context by talking about where certain presidents fall. The Reconstructive Presidency is a presidency in which the president has been elected as part of a repudiation of the established political norms of a vulnerable regime. So a regime is vulnerable when they no longer address the needs of the nation in one or more ways. And so the reconstructive president actually acts as a disruption or an interruption in political time, discredits the previous ways of doing things, and claims to, and does, have a warrant to, quote, remake the government wholesale. So Skowrnek views as reconstructive presidents like Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Reagan. That these presidents really changed the way that presidents governed after them, and set off a new regime. And you can kind of think about this a little bit in terms of which political figure each party looks to, right? Because usually each political party looks back to its last reconstructive president as the best president. So, JFK didn't have enough time to possibly be a reconstructive president. But, a lot of people look to JFK or FDR in the Democratic Party, but certainly conservatives in the Republican Party look to Reagan as the gold standard. And that is because of his nature as a reconstructive president. Articulating presidents are those who come immediately after and who seek to promote the policies of the reconstructive president. They don't remain stagnant, they innovate on their own, but they're kind of confined to what the reconstructive president sets out. And Skowrnek says more presidents fall into this category than any other category. So this includes presidents like Monroe, Polk, Theodore Roosevelt, and Lyndon Johnson. Preemptive presidents fall between articulating presidents and disjunctive ones, and they stem from the opposition rather than the regime itself. So in other words, they usually come from the opposition party. Because they come from the opposition, they don't have to articulate what the reconstructive president has said, and can kind of preempt by playing upon political divisions within the establishment. So preemptive presidents have some authority to repudiate, but not wholesale authority like reconstructive presidents. In other words, they can sort of say those ideas of the past are bad, but they can't come up with new ideas of their own because they don't have enough political capital. So preemptive presidents are presidents like Tyler, Andrew Johnson, Nixon, Wilson, and Clinton. Disjunctive presidents are usually thought of as generally bad presidents. These are presidents that precede reconstructive presidents. They're affiliated with this vulnerable regime that's falling apart, and their authority and methods are called into question, and they are deemed as being irrelevant in terms of the policy of the day. They try and work to continue the work of the vulnerable regime, even though they're being called into question. So they can't really, they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. So disjunctive presidents include presidents like Adams, both Adams actually, Pierce, Buchanan, Hoover, Carter. And if you notice, all of these are thought of as fairly weak presidents who came before a reconstructive president. So John Quincy Adams was followed by Andrew Jackson, Buchanan was followed by Lincoln, Hoover by FDR, Carter by Reagan. That these are presidents who typically serve one term, that do not tend to control much policy that happens during their presidency, and who are thought of typically as poor performers in the presidency. All of this is done to say, not necessarily that you have to remember every single box, but that there's this idea that the presidency is renewing, it's cycling over time, and that a president, to succeed, needs to take note of not only the current historical elements of politics, but also his place in time, and where he falls in this political time, and how he should exercise power based on where he falls. that brings us to Barber, which was the assigned reading for today, but we're going to go in a little more depth than Barber did in that reading. Barber is an interesting reading, this idea of presidential character, because it is kind of a little pop psychology mixed into presidential politics. There are some people who view this as largely, you know, inconsequential, and then there are others who feel it's very important. So your view of it might not be positive, that's fine, but it is one way of looking at the presidency. And probably not as in-depth as that of Tulis or Skowrnek, but more psychological, to be sure. So Barber says that it's important to look at character of someone who is president. And we look at character in terms of the way in which someone views life on an enduring basis. So this is something that starts very young, follows you throughout life, can be influenced by your parents, siblings, peers, as well as yourself. And that these issues of character follow from childhood into adolescence and into the presidency. And therefore, character affects what people do in the presidency, and whether they are successful or not. So Barber asks two questions of every president to determine how they should be categorized. The first question is, what is the energy that the person brings to the office of president or any political leader? In other words, is the president active or passive? Active meaning they actively seek out these roles. This is something they enjoy, typically. Passive meaning they see it as a sense of duty. And then what is the tenor of the person's political life? Is his political life happy or sad? Is it angry or more positive? Does he enjoy it or find it discouraging? So the first question determines whether a president is active or passive, but the second determines whether he is positive or negative in life as a whole, or political life as a whole. So you get four categories out of that because you have two questions with two possible responses. You have active positive, active negative, passive positive, and passive negative. So this is the typology, right? There are four boxes where you can be put, and by answering those two questions previous to that. So if we look at these boxes, what we see is that there are four types of presidents according to Barber. There's active positive, active negative, and passive negative. Active positive are usually those presidents who we see as both enjoying the job and being good at it and having a greater sense of purpose. So that they enjoy the activity, they have a lot of it, they have a high sense of self-worth, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not thought of as overbearing. And they're generally good at politics. They want results and they work hard to get them. So examples of this, according to Barber, are Jefferson, FDR, Truman, JFK, Ford, Carter, H.W. Bush, which was kind of a surprise to me, but who actively engage in political life and have a generally positive view on politics. So you can think of them as goal-oriented, right? Passive positive, on the other hand, they seek affection and do not necessarily enjoy being president or leader. They don't look to use the presidency actively, but they generally take a positive view of the world and politics in it. So they're trying to please people, not necessarily make new policy. So examples of this, again, according to Barber, Madison, Taft, Harding, and Reagan. They are affection-oriented rather than goal-oriented. On the opposite side, active negative, these are people who seek power as a reward but are never satisfied with it. They are probably the people who you would least like. And in fact, Barber says they are the most detrimental to the U.S. These are people who want validation for situations that have occurred long before the presidency, usually from childhood. And so they're unable to concede error or loss. They fear losing control, and they usually go overboard in a very negative way. and they're oriented towards power rather than goal or affection. So he says Adams, Wilson, Hoover, Johnson, and Nixon all fall into this category. Then there is passive negative. These are people who, the president for whom the presidency is not work nor play, but is a duty. This is something they have to do. It's a sense of duty to the country and sometimes to themselves. They react to situations rather than initiating new situations, so they're not there to change the role of the presidency or to change the world, but necessarily just to kind of hold the fort down. So Washington, Coolidge, Eisenhower would all be examples of this. What Barber says is that you can look at all of these typologies and determine whether or not someone is going to be a successful president by how they fall into one of these categories. That isn't to say that we haven't had successful presidents that are passive positive or passive negative, although I think he would say the ones that are active negative are not at all positive. It's just to say that those who are active positive actually enjoy what they do and are good at that, whereas passive positive are probably not actively seeking out the work of the presidency, but take a generally positive view of politics and its role in daily life. Barber's main contention is that we should know, voters should know, where each candidate stands in terms of this typology before we vote so that we can make an educated decision. And that it is only when we know how successful a president is going to be that we know whether or not we should vote for him or her. Again, people debate whether this is a good method or not, but you can start to see where much of our discussion, especially punditry discussion, of presidents falls into this Barber realm. And this is both because Barber, wrote more popularly in popular magazines about this, but it's also because it really works well with our views of the presidency, that if people just tried more, they could do more. If they were just more active positive, maybe they could do more as president. But Barber's typology falls into the trap of the things that Greenblatt and Orenstein warned us about, that presidential politics is more than just personality. So with that, I will leave you with the thoughts on the presidency. We'll talk soon.